Welcome to the Deep Dive, where I uploaded my transcript for the podcast and have two AI hosts talk about it. They may go into more depth than I went into. So without further ado, here's the Deep Dive.
All right. So, it seems like we're really trying to get a clearer picture of cluster B personality disorders with this deep dive.
Yeah.
You sent over a ton of material.
Yeah.
And the focus seems to be on really trying to understand the motivations behind these behaviors that can be so challenging to deal with.
Well, it really is like a puzzle where the pieces constantly change shape.
Mm-hmm.
You see similar behaviors across the different disorders, but the underlying reasons why they're doing these things are completely distinct.
Okay. So you've even got some alternative terms here.
Yeah.
IDD for antisocial personality disorder, ESFD for narcissistic personality disorder. Can you walk me through why you chose those?
Well, I find using simpler language can really help cut through the clinical jargon.
Yeah.
So IDD stands for Intentionally Deceitful Disorder.
Okay.
And ESFD is Exaggerated Self-Focus Disorder.
Okay.
And I think it just highlights the core behavioral patterns in a more direct way.
Interesting. So let's dive into some of the specific behaviors that jumped out at me from this material.
Okay.
I was struck by all the different manipulation tactics described, from, gaslighting and isolation to love bombing, and even something called flying monkeys.
Oh, yeah.
What's the deal with that one?
Well, think of flying monkeys as like the supporting cast in a manipulative play.
Oh, okay.
Someone with a cluster B disorder might enlist other people,
Yeah.
friends, family members, to unwittingly do their bidding.
Oh, wow.
They might spread rumors, try to discredit you, or even try to isolate you further.
Oh, gosh.
It's really a way of extending their influence and control.
So it's not just one person manipulating you, but potentially a whole network.
Yeah, it can be.
That's incredibly insidious.
It's particularly effective because it makes the target question their own reality.
right.
Like they start to wonder if they're the problem, if everyone is against them.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful way to undermine someone's confidence and sense of self.
That ties into another topic in the material, discarding.
Mm-hmm.
There's this chilling example of someone being abruptly dumped after a seemingly insignificant incident. A simple clap on the back after a competition.
Oh, wow.
How could something so minor trigger such an extreme reaction?
Well, remember, we're dealing with incredibly fragile egos and a deep-seated fear of rejection. For someone with ESFD, for example, that clap on the back might be perceived as a threat to their image, a public humiliation.
Oh.
And so their emotional response is completely out of proportion to the event because their internal experience is so intense.
So it's like they're living in a different emotional reality.
Yeah.
It almost makes you wonder if they're intentionally being hurtful.
Well, that's where understanding the lack of empathy comes in.
Okay.
The material makes a distinction between emotional empathy, feeling what someone else is feeling, and logical empathy,
Okay.
which is intellectually understanding someone's emotions.
Got it.
People with cluster B disorders often struggle with both to varying degrees.
There's this really heartbreaking story about someone trying to comfort their partner who was terrified of being abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like they just couldn't grasp the depth of their partner's emotional distress.
Yeah, that's a classic example of the empathy gap.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're necessarily malicious.
Right.
It's more that their internal world is so all-consuming that they simply can't make space for the feelings of others.
Mm-hmm.
Their own needs and anxieties take center stage.
It's like they're trapped in their own emotional echo chamber,
Yeah,
unable to hear anything outside of their own experience.
precisely.
And that's why trying to reason with someone who lacks empathy can be so frustrating. You're essentially speaking different emotional languages.
Yeah, exactly.
And this fear of abandonment seems to be a driving force behind so many of the other behaviors, right?
Absolutely.
The source material describes it as an overwhelming terror of being left,
Right.
leading to these extreme behaviors to prevent perceived rejection. There's this almost paradoxical example of someone getting back on a dating app while in a supposedly committed relationship.
Oh, jeez.
What's the logic there?
Well, it might seem counterintuitive, but it's all about control.
Oh.
By having other options lined up, they feel less vulnerable to being hurt.
Oh.
It's a way of preemptively rejecting the other person before they can be rejected.
So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of abandonment.
Yeah.
They're creating the very situation they're terrified of.
Exactly. And that fear of abandonment is closely tied to another challenge difficulty with object constancy.
Now, you're going to have to explain this one for me.
Okay.
What exactly is object constancy?
Sure.
And why is it such a big deal in these relationships?
Well, object constancy is the ability to maintain a stable emotional connection to someone, even when they're not physically present.
Okay.
Or when there's conflict. It's knowing that the relationship is secure.
Okay.
Even when there's temporary distance or disagreement.
Okay. I'm starting to see how that could be problematic.
Yeah, so people with cluster B disorders often struggle with this.
Mm-hmm.
They might feel like the relationship is on the verge of collapse every time there's a separation or an argument.
Oh, wow.
It can lead to extreme clinginess, accusations, emotional outbursts, all driven by this desperate need to reestablish that connection and quell their anxiety.
So it's like their emotional world is built on quicksand.
Yeah.
There's no sense of stability or security.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this lack of stability is further amplified by another common dynamic, the cycle of idealization and devaluation.
Yeah, the material really delves into that one.
Yeah.
It describes this constant swing between putting their partner on a pedestal and then tearing them down.
Right.
That sounds incredibly emotionally draining.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
During the idealization phase, you might be showered with affection and praise, made to feel like the most amazing person in the world.
Uh-huh.
It's exhilarating,
Right.
almost intoxicating.
But then the devaluation phase hits.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're being criticized,
Right.
belittled, or even ignored. It's like a complete 180.
Yeah.
What triggers that shift?
Well, it could be anything.
Oh, gosh.
A perceived slight,
Yeah.
a difference of opinion, even something as simple as not being available when they need attention.
Wow.
Remember, their self-image is incredibly fragile.
Right.
They're constantly projecting their own insecurities and internal turmoil onto the relationship.
So they're not really seeing you for who you are. They're seeing a reflection of their own emotional chaos.
Exactly. And that's why these cycles can be so difficult to break. It's not about you. It's about their own internal struggles.
This all sounds incredibly emotionally taxing for the person on the receiving end.
It is.
It's like you're constantly walking on eggshells,
Right.
never knowing what might trigger the next emotional outburst.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it often leads to a feeling of utter helplessness.
Oh,
But here's the crucial thing to remember. You are not responsible for fixing someone else's emotional instability.
you can't teach someone to have empathy or object constancy if they're not willing to do the work themselves.
Exactly.
And that brings us to another important aspect highlighted in the material interpersonal exploitation.
Yes.
The source material really emphasizes this as a recurring pattern of using others for personal gain without any regard for their feelings.
Right. And it can take many forms.
Oh, wow.
From financial manipulation to emotional coercion.
Oh, gosh.
The key is that the person doing the exploiting is primarily focused on their own needs, with little to no concern for the impact of their actions on others.
There's this example in the material that really struck me. Someone using their partner's truck for competitions and taking advantage of their financial support, even after being abandoned by that partner.
Oh, wow.
That seems like a clear-cut case of exploitation.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And it highlights the transactional nature of many of these relationships.
Right.
People are seen as resources to be used, rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration.
So it's less about genuine connection and more about what they can get out of the relationship.
Unfortunately, that's often the case.
Gosh.
And this ties into another challenge, the constant need for external validation.
The material describes this as a compulsive need to have others affirm their worth or value,
Right.
often at the expense of personal integrity or genuine connection.
It's like they're running on empty, constantly trying to siphon energy and affirmation from everyone around them.
Yeah.
You're expected to prop up their self-esteem,
Right.
to offer praise and reassurance even when it feels unearned.
It makes you wonder if they even believe the praise they're seeking. Is it just about filling a void regardless of the source?
That's a great question,
Yeah.
and one that's difficult to answer definitively,
Right.
but it speaks to the profound insecurity that often lies at the heart of these disorders.
Yeah.
They're so reliant on external validation that they lose sight of their own inherent worth.
And that lack of internal validation seems to make it even harder for them to take responsibility for their actions, right?
Absolutely.
The material talks about this difficulty with accountability
Yeah.
as a major roadblock in these relationships.
Big time.
There's a story about someone refusing to take responsibility for their actions and instead blaming their partner for months on end.
Oh, geez.
It sounds like any attempt at resolving conflicts would be futile.
It's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
And it creates a toxic dynamic where growth and resolution are impossible.
Right.
You're trapped in a loop of blame and denial.
Yeah.
Constantly trying to explain basic concepts of responsibility that should be self-evident.
It's like trying to have a college-level discussion with someone who's still in elementary school emotionally.
Wow.
You're constantly having to teach, explain, and justify basic emotional principles.
That's a powerful analogy.
Yeah.
And it leads to a profound sense of exhaustion and resentment for the person on the receiving end.
Speaking of exhaustion, the material also talks about boundary violations as a major issue in these relationships.
Right, because setting and maintaining boundaries is essential for any healthy relationship. But for someone with a cluster B disorder, those lines can become incredibly blurry.
It feels like a classic case of trying to control the narrative.
It's about asserting power, manipulating the situation to make themselves look good, and deflecting responsibility.
Right.
It's incredibly damaging to the other person's sense of self and autonomy.
So they're not just violating your boundaries, they're trying to shrink you down to fit into their distorted view of the world.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to set firm boundaries in these relationships.
Yeah.
Even though it can be incredibly challenging,
Yeah.
you have to protect your own sense of self.
Right.
And make it clear that their behavior is not acceptable.
All of these behaviors seem to stem from this core issue the material calls emotional dysregulation. It defines it as an inability to manage and control emotional responses in a healthy way.
It's like their emotional thermostat is broken.
Yeah.
They experience these intense highs and lows with no steady ground in between.
There's this description of their emotional states as being like a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Sudden highs and lows with no warning.
That's a very accurate portrayal.
Right.
And it's why these relationships can be so exhausting. You're constantly bracing yourself for the next emotional swing,
Yeah.
never knowing what might trigger an outburst or meltdown.
It's like living in a perpetual state of emotional whiplash.
Yes.
And on top of all of that, there's the attention-seeking behaviors.
Right. The source material distinguishes this from simply enjoying attention.
Right.
Everyone likes to feel seen and appreciated.
Sure.
But for people with cluster B traits, this need for attention becomes insatiable,
Yeah.
often driving their actions in manipulative and destructive ways.
It even claims that these attention-seeking behaviors can be a form of control.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about seeking validation. It's about dominating situations,
Right, yeah.
being the center of attention, and dictating how others perceive them.
They're constantly performing for an audience.
Yeah.
Even if the audience is just one person.
Wow.
It's about controlling the narrative and making sure the spotlight remains firmly fixed on them.
It all paints a pretty overwhelming picture.
Yeah.
So for our listener out there, if you're recognizing these patterns in your own life, what's the most important thing to remember?
That you are not the problem. You can't be responsible for someone else's emotional dysfunction.
Right.
And you can't force someone to change if they're not willing to do the work themselves.
But change is possible, right?
Absolutely.
The material mentions therapy and self-awareness as crucial components of any progress.
Yeah, it's not about a magical cure,
Right.
but it's about learning to manage these patterns,
Yeah.
developing healthier coping mechanisms, and becoming more aware of the impact of one's actions on others.
So while the road to change might be long and challenging, it's not impossible.
Exactly. And in part 2 of our deep dive, we'll explore the complexities of that journey and what it really means to navigate these challenges in a way that prioritizes your own well-being.
Great. I look forward to it. Welcome back. So last time we really dug into the behaviors associated with cluster B personality disorders.
Yeah,
It can feel pretty bleak when you lay it all out like that.
it's true.
Yeah.
These patterns can create a lot of pain and confusion,
Right.
both for the individuals with these traits and the people around them.
But we ended on a note of hope,
Yeah.
recognizing that change is possible.
Right.
So let's dive into what that journey might look like.
Okay.
The material we've been going through doesn't offer a step-by-step guide,
Right.
but it does touch on some important principles.
It does.
One of the most crucial, and often the most challenging, is the idea of setting boundaries.
Yes. Setting boundaries with anyone can be tough.
Right.
But with someone who has a cluster B disorder,
Yeah.
it feels almost impossible.
Yeah, it does.
They're master manipulators.
Right.
Their emotions are all over the place.
Yeah.
And they often have a strong need for control.
So how do you actually do that?
Right.
How do you set effective boundaries with someone who might not even recognize that they're crossing lines?
Well, it requires a combination of clarity, consistency, and detachment.
Okay.
You have to be incredibly specific about what behaviors are unacceptable
Okay.
and what the consequences will be if those boundaries are violated.
Got it.
And this is the hard part.
Yeah.
You have to be prepared to follow through on those consequences,
Wow.
even if it means distancing yourself from the relationship.
That sounds incredibly tough, especially if you care about the person.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act of compassion and self-preservation.
Right.
You can care about someone deeply and still recognize that their behavior is harmful to you.
There's that saying about not being able to pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of your own emotional well-being before you can even begin to help someone else.
Precisely. And the source material makes a really important point about choosing relationships that bring peace and growth.
Yes.
Rather than constantly trying to fix or rescue someone.
That resonates with me.
Yeah.
You can't be someone else's therapist or emotional savior.
Right.
It's not about fixing them.
Well,
it's about recognizing your own limits and honoring your own needs.
And that leads us back to the idea of therapy and self-awareness.
Yeah.
As crucial components of any journey of change, both for the individual with the cluster B disorder and for the people in their lives.
So even though the material we've been looking at claims there are no documented cases of these disorders being cured,
Right.
it doesn't mean change is impossible.
No, it doesn't.
It's more about shifting the focus from eradication to management and growth, right?
Exactly. These are personality disorders,
Right.
not personality death sentences. Therapy can provide the tools and strategies for managing emotions, developing healthier coping mechanisms,
Yeah.
and understanding the impact of one's actions on others.
And self-awareness is key.
Yes.
Because you can't change what you don't acknowledge. If someone is completely oblivious to how their behavior is affecting others,
Yeah.
there's no motivation to do anything differently.
Right. It's about building that emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Recognizing and understanding both your own emotions
Yeah.
and the emotions of others.
And that's a skill that benefits everyone,
Absolutely.
not just those with cluster B disorders.
Right.
So while a complete cure might not be realistic,
Right.
significant improvement is possible
Yes.
with the right support and a willingness to do the work.
Absolutely.
It sounds like that work involves a lot of uncomfortable self-reflection
It does.
and a commitment to challenging deeply ingrained patterns.
It's not an easy journey, but it's a worthwhile one. And ultimately, it's about reclaiming your own power and choosing to create a life that is defined by growth, authenticity, and healthy connections.
And remembering that you deserve to be in relationships where you're not constantly walking on eggshells or feeling emotionally drained.
Right.
You deserve to be with someone who meets you at your level,
Yes.
who understands the language of empathy, respect, and accountability.
Absolutely. And you have the right to walk away from any relationship that is consistently causing you pain or undermining your well-being.
This is some heavy stuff,
It is.
but I feel like we've covered so much ground already.
We have.
Do we have more to dive into?
We do. And I think this next part will be helpful for our listener as we shift our focus from understanding the patterns to exploring ways to navigate these challenges in a way that protects their own emotional health.
We spent a lot of time unpacking the complexities of cluster B personality disorders.
Yeah.
Really, getting into the why behind these behaviors that can be so difficult to deal with. And last time we started exploring what that journey of change might look like, emphasizing the importance of setting boundaries,
Right.
even though it can feel incredibly daunting.
It can.
So let's say our listener is in a relationship with someone who exhibits these traits.
Okay.
What are some practical tips for setting those boundaries effectively?
Sure.
It's easy to say set boundaries,
Right.
but the reality seems much more complicated.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yay.
And it requires a lot of patience, self-awareness, and resilience.
Okay.
But here's what the material highlights as essential components.
Okay.
First, clarity is key. You have to be crystal clear about what behaviors are unacceptable and communicate those limits in a way that is direct and unambiguous.
So no more beating around the bush
Right.
or hoping they'll just get it.
Exactly. It's about saying, when you do X, it makes me feel Y. And I'm not okay with that. Avoid getting caught up in lengthy explanations.
Right.
Or trying to justify your feelings.
Right.
Just state the boundary clearly and calmly.
And then comes the consistency piece, right?
Yes, consistency is crucial.
Yeah.
You have to enforce those boundaries every single time they're crossed.
Okay.
This means having clear consequences in place
Okay.
and being prepared to follow through on them, even if it's difficult.
That sounds tough. What are some examples of effective consequences?
Well, it really depends on the situation and the severity of the boundary violation.
Okay.
It could be something as simple as ending the conversation, leaving the room,
Okay.
or taking a break from the relationship.
Right.
In more serious cases, it might mean limiting contact,
Yeah.
seeking professional help, or even ending the relationship altogether.
That last one sounds incredibly difficult,
It is.
especially if you love this person.
But here's the thing,
Okay.
and this is something the source material emphasizes. You are not responsible for someone else's emotional well-being.
Right.
You can't force someone to change if they're not willing to do the work themselves.
It's that oxygen mask analogy again.
Exactly.
You have to take care of yourself first before you can help anyone else.
Precisely. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and the other person
Yeah.
is to create that space for them to face the consequences of their actions.
So setting boundaries is not about punishment or control.
No.
It's about protecting yourself
Right.
and creating an environment where growth and healing are possible.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that setting boundaries is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time conversation.
Right.
It's an ongoing commitment to honoring your own needs and limits.
It also seems like setting those boundaries could trigger a lot of pushback
Oh, absolutely.
from someone with a cluster B disorder.
They might try to manipulate you,
Oh, gosh.
guilt trip you,
Right.
or even escalate their behavior in an attempt to regain control.
So it's about staying grounded in your own reality.
Yes.
Not getting sucked into their emotional vortex.
Right. It's about recognizing their tactics and refusing to engage.
Right.
Don't get caught up in defending yourself
Wow.
or trying to reason with them.
Okay.
Just restate the boundary,
Yeah.
enforce the consequence, and disengage.
That sounds easier said than done.
It is.
Any tips for staying detached in those emotionally charged moments?
Well, the material suggests practicing mindfulness techniques,
Okay.
like deep breathing or grounding exercise.
Right.
It's also helpful to have a support system in place.
Okay.
Friends, family members, or a therapist
Yeah.
who can offer a reality check and remind you of your worth.
So it's like having an emotional safety net to catch you when things get shaky.
And remember, you're not alone in this.
Yeah.
There are resources available, and there is hope for a brighter future, even if it doesn't look like a complete cure.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of these complex disorders
Good.
and what it means to navigate these challenges in a healthy way.
I agree.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and to our listener out there,
Yeah.
if you're struggling with these issues, either personally or in your relationships,
Yeah.
remember that knowledge is power.
Right.
Understanding these patterns is the first step towards creating a life that is defined by authenticity, respect, and emotional well-being.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.